Es ist jetzt 28. Ja.
Die Leute, die aus dem Publikum werden was sagen, gleich den Bitten vielleicht verstärkt zu dem Mikrofon.
Habe ich, genau. So, alle, die hier sitzen, bitte lieber dieses Mikrofon benutzen, wenn Fragen gestellt werden. Das da steht so ein bisschen im Off und man kann das schlecht einfangen. Es macht weniger her über das Internet. Also bitte das da benutzen. Keine Fragen stellen ohne Mikrofon, bitte. Welcome everybody for the third and last session of today of the Sound Lab of Professor Bad Trip. We have two talks, each one of three quarters of an hour. Jakob Rieke, and after that Professor Dr. Gaia Von Zichowski. Jakob Rieke, welcome.
Hello.
He's a performer and visual artist. He holds a bachelor degree in church music from the Musikhochschule Lübeck, and he is currently studying music theory at the same institution. He also works as a part-time journalist for the Lübecker Nachrichten here in town, and his special field of expertise is Neo-Riemannian theory, but I guess that wouldn't help him today for his talk. Being an evolved landscape, the music of Romitelli under changing literary influences. Only one short mention. Please, everybody who joins us on YouTube is very kindly invited to ask questions also in the chat, and I will read them here and give them to the speakers. Jakob.
Hello again. I hope everyone had enjoyed his good lunch. Just 5 minutes ago, I realized that lunch happened to be a pretty perfect introduction to my talk. In 1959, William Burroughs published his most famous novel, The Naked Lunch. It is one of the most important works of the Beat Generation and was adapted by the artist Gianluca Lerici, alias Professor Bad Trip, as a comic strip under the title Il Pasto Nudo. In The Naked Lunch, Burroughs describes episodes from the life of the gay junkie Bill, who wanders through the downsides of a media-overdriven American world in a frenzy of violence, sex, and drugs, always looking for the next trip. The individual chapters of the novel are assembled in cut-up technique, which means that there's no conventional chronological narrative thread. The reader enters the plot at a random point, and if one wants, they can also read the book backwards or starting in the middle. Similar to Burroughs, I will build my lecture from individual facets. We will simply start somewhere, talk about some writers who had an influence on Romitelli's music, and finally look at the overall picture that emerges. Romitelli often went into foreign territory in search of inspiration. Even though his work naturally shows clear influences from the contemporary music scene, he himself also likes to talk about rock music, FX Twin, or the painter Francis Bacon. Romitelli particularly often quotes well-known writers, poets, and philosophers in his works, program texts, and interviews. I have retraced these hints and looked at which books Romitelli read and from where he drew his inspiration. The works he received create a landscape full of intertextual cross-references. I have graphically recreated this landscape. Various writers and poets are gradually grouped around Romitelli. In his early work, the most important are Gabriele D'Annunzio, which we just heard in Daniel Müller's Vortrag, Pablo Neruda, the ancient Greek poet Ibicus, Salvatore Quasimodo, Giambattista Marino, and William Shakespeare. Romitelli has selected texts from these authors and incorporated them, often as titles, directly into his work. There are about 20 works from Romitelli's student years in the Fondazione Giorgiosini. It is remarkable that 6 of them are based on texts by D'Annunzio. In the years that follow, new characters enter the stage. Henri Michaud, Aldous Huxley, James Graham Ballard, H.P. Lovecraft, William Burroughs, Arthur Rimbaud, Emily Dickinson, Roland Barthes, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Emile Cioran, Theodor Adorno, Jim Morrison, and last but not least, Gianluca Lerici, alias Professor Badtrip. Fascinatingly, the works of these artists are not only closely related to Romitelli, but also to each other. By entering all the connections in the map that exist between the people mentioned, the intertextual landscape in which Romitelli works becomes clearly visible. It is somewhat surprising how close Romitelli and Gianluca Lerici are here. Clearly, Romitelli found his own artistic interests congenially realized in the work of Professor Badtrip. To what extent Romitelli got to know writers like Burroughs, Ballard, or Huxley through Lerici, or whether he recognizes their influence in the latter's work, I cannot judge. Romitelli's early work is still virtually completely unknown, and I will leave it unmentioned in this lecture, even though there are many references to literature in Romitelli's early compositions, and he already turns to certain themes there. For example, the topic of time and of light, as we heard in Daniel's lecture. However, he abandons many thematic emphasis from the early years later on. One notices that from a certain point in time, around 1990, Romitelli came into contact with a completely different field of literature. Before that, he sought inspiration from well-known Nobel Prize winners, classical poets of literature canon, and Italian national authors. From 1990 onwards, however, he immersed himself in a large intertextual network of writers who quoted each other. Let's start with Henri Michaud, the French poet and painter. Romitelli emphasizes that Michaud's influence on his work, especially Professor Badtrip, was huge. Michaud explored the effects of the drug mescaline in his 3 works Miserable Miracle, Infinite Turbulence, and Perception Through Abysses, and recorded his experiences and thoughts in experimental documentary protocols. Here's a quote from Infinite Turbulence. Mescaline never makes nature at all. It does not know nature. It is a composer and mechanic. The usage of mescaline deactivates certain filters of perception and thus opens the senses. As if someone in me was handling a regulating resistor to let through more or less stream, more or less of my defense. Romitelli, however, was not only interested in an altered perception of reality, but also in imaginary worlds, that means in visions. With closed eyes, one has inner visions, thousands and thousands of microscopic flashpoints, dazzling diamonds, flashes for microbes. An extremism in the light that drills into the nerves with erupting brilliance. Extremism in the colors that bite you, jump at you, and brutal, hurtful their composition. Trembling in the images, swinging back and forth, intoxicating optics. Mescaline is known to produce optical visions above all. What is remarkable about this passage is the violence and intensity with which Michaud is assailed by the visions. Apart from the temporary effects, Romitelli may also have had a great interest in the dramaturgy of a masculine intoxication. In Infinite Turbulence, Michaud writes about 8 experiments with mescaline. Each follows an individual dramaturgy, which is, however, always characterized by different phases. First, impatience, then waiting for the visions, then the occurrence of the first visual effects and their persistence for several hours, and finally, sometimes a long period of disillusionment. The 3 lessons of Professor Badtrip are certainly inspired by this process. Michaud described the phase of impatience thus: waiting for visions, while yet the masculine before them and above all creates an ocean of movements. These ever-repeating movements have also given the book its title, Infinite Turbulence. Infinity, even if it is only apparently infinite, can be addressed in 3 ways: the pure way, the diabolical manner, and in the style of insanity. Romitelli seemed equally obsessed with the idea of infinity. In Michaud's work, infinite repetition is emblematic of obsession. A person in a masculine frenzy, as Michaud describes it, clings to details and perceives objects and movements multiplied. Everything appears multiplied as if through a kaleidoscope. And I have to thank you, Mr. Beneventi, for saying that Romitelli realizes a kaleidoscope sound in Golfi di Rombua. The text of Michaud reproduces this multiplying mimetically. You have to go through it, always one after the other, endlessly contracted, then pulled apart, then contracted, then pulled apart, then contracted, then pulled apart, never letting go of the tyranny of alternation. We find in Michaud 5 important themes that Romitelli took up and incorporated into his music: the idea of filtered reality, visions, intoxicated states, infinity, and obsession, represented by repetition. However, I can already note here that Romitelli is not directly interested in the drugs and their effects. He is interested in Michaud's way of writing, in his diction, which results from the drug experience. I will talk about this in more detail later. Through his intensive work on Michaud, Romitelli presumably came across another essay that had already appeared a few years earlier and also dealt with the effects of mescaline. Aldous Huxley's essay, The Doors of Perception, written in 1954. Except for obsession, Huxley had already dealt with the themes just mentioned. Huxley developed the theory of the mechanism of mescaline as deactivation of the perceptual filters. It is precisely those impressions that do not usually pass through the doors of perception that can be perceived in the mescaline intoxication. For example, especially intense color impressions. Huxley questions why people generally use drugs like mescaline. When, for whatever reason, man and woman fail to transcend themselves by means of worship, good works, and spiritual exercises, they are apt to the resort to religion's chemical surrogates. Drug intoxication as a substitute for transcendence in religion. Huxley explains it thus. Countless persons desire self-transcendence and would be glad to find it in church. They take part in rites, they listen to sermons, they repeat prayers, but their thirst remains unassuaged. Romitelli was greatly fascinated with rituals, and I think we find an explanation for this here. The ritual as a reference to religious tradition. Huxley got his ideas from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a religious text over 1,000 years old, that was first translated into English in 1927 and became popular in Huxley's time. Besides descriptions of the brightly illuminated nirvana, it also contains mantras with which a trance state can be achieved. So, it seemed to be a solution in the search for ritual transcendence. Romitelli was so impressed by the Tibetan Book of the Dead that he used a mantra from it in 2 compositions, in Entrance and in Lost. In addition to the central topoi of vision, infinity, intoxication, and filtered reality, we have now found ritual in Huxley's text. With the ritual, Huxley deals with a theme that Michaud later omits. In this context of ritual, we urgently need to talk about James Graham Ballard, a British science fiction author. We are talking about the novel The Atrocity Exhibition. In Ballard's novel, the idea of ritual is increased to an ecstatic fantasy of violence. In 20th century terms, the crucifixion, for example, would be reenacted as a conceptual auto-disaster. Here, the most central and cruel ritual of Christianity is profaned. Moreover, Ballard always associates ritualized violence with an obsessive desire for lust, including explicit sexual pleasure. A few years after this, he took this idea further in his novel Crash, which deals with the perverse sexual stimulation from car crashes. Atrocity Exhibition consists largely of imagined forays into the protagonist's subconscious, which presents itself as a barren desert landscape of sand and concrete, framed by oversized billboards. Ballard equates this psychic landscape inside the protagonist with a media world surrounding him and coins the term media landscape for it, by which he means the unnatural environment that surrounds us, a product of the media world consisting of radio broadcasts, television commercials, and violent Hollywood films. Given the unlimited opportunities which the media landscape now offers to the wayward imagination, I feel we should immerse ourselves in the most destructive element, ourselves, and swim. Romitelli quotes exactly that passage in The Composer as Virus, but he distorts it. Romitelli is generally not a very careful citator. He interprets Ballard's quotation this way, that one should immerse oneself in the dangerous influences from outside. So there's a change of meaning. However, Romitelli takes this immersion very seriously. He delves into his own influences from rock, trash, and pop culture and deals with immersion in a trance itself and with the experience of tripping. Romitelli said in an interview with Véronique Brandot, "I think that a certain type of perception and consequently of writing derived from the use of drugs has the power to upset our terms as learned composers, our way of thinking about the artistic fact." In this, surprisingly, he refers to Roland Barthes' text, Writing Degree Zero, a major text of modern literary criticism. In it, Barthes develops the term diction, which, in contrast to personal style and socially shaped language, depends on the context of a work's creation. Romitelli says, "The composer is the language he creates. There's nothing stronger, more violent than language itself." The way in which Michaud adapts the writing of his terse masculine protocol to the effect of the drug, for example by repeating words, expresses precisely this principle. Romitelli has appropriated it compositionally. He writes, "Musical language is not only the means of expressing something, it coincides with the content. It is the mean and the end at the same time, the word and the thing, signifier and signified." Using Stéphane Mallarmé's modern poetry as an example, Barthes describes how in lyrical language the individual word is forcibly removed from the syntax. Nature becomes a succession of suddenly vertically erected objects, filled with all their possibilities, which can only spread out at intervals over an unfilled and thus terrifying world. Object words, without connection, adorned with all the violence of their eruption, whose purely mechanical vibration still touches the following word in a strange way, but immediately comes to rest. Romitelli adapts these thoughts and replaces the word through the sound for his compositional purposes. A quotation in Romitelli's music, such as the Pink Floyd intro in Index of Metal or the Strauss quotation in Dead City Radio, must therefore not be understood as a postmodern collage, as Romitelli himself also emphasizes, but rather as pure sound, which, torn out of its former context, stands solitary in the soundscape. Barth writes, "The writer's language, suspended between destroyed and still unknown forms, is not so much a fundus as an outermost limit. One goes to the limit of the known cultural realm with this kind of writing/composing. Barth later writes, "Language is literature taken to the borders of the promised land, that is, to the borders of a land without literature, of which, however, it is precisely the writer who would have to give testimony of." Romitelli crossed this border with Domeniche alla periferia dell'impero, that opened the door to the other side a bit and show us a glimpse of an otherworldly cultural empire. Sunday, Domeniche, loses its function as a holiday. It is detached out of the promised land. That means it is detached out of its religious context. Romitelli may have found this skepticism towards religion in Emil Cioran, the Romanian radical skeptic. In his work, The Trouble with Being Born, Cioran writes, "I have always thought the landscape prior to God, hence my preference for chaos." Using the example of his own longings, he diagnoses modern society with a, so to speak, pathological thirst for chaos, a need for transcendental experiences outside the ritual boundaries of a religion. Cioran also comments on modern literature and condenses Barth's thoughts into the following sentence: "No kind of literary originality is possible unless language is tortured and suppressed." Cioran gets to the point. I have no idea how Romitelli became aware of this book, but in Cioran he found many of the dark themes that preoccupied him concentrated in aphorisms. The connection between intoxication and consciousness, the violent use of language, and last but not least, the requirement for contemporary artists to step out of the comfort zone of their own métier. Cioran writes, "One only enriches oneself by frequenting disciplines that are distant from one's own." In the interview with Véronique Brandot for Ensemble Intercontemporain, Romitelli mentions the following aphorism, also significantly distorted, which addresses the relationship between artist, work, and recipient. Here's the wording by Cioran. "A work only exists if it is prepared in the shadows with the attention, with the care of the assassin who is meditating his deed. In both cases, the main thing is the will to strike." The relationship between artist and addressee is here a direct, brutal, and confrontational ideal. Romitelli found the contrast to this relationship in Theodor Adorno. In his essay from 1944, Culture Industry, Adorno writes the following: "Already today, works of art, appropriately presented, are instilled by the culture industry at reduced prices into a reluctant public. The relationship between artist and addressee, which in Adorno's view degenerate into producer and consumer, is disturbed. Transmission no longer takes place in the direct way. The whole world is passed through the filter of the culture industry. The culture industry, from which Ballard's media landscape also emerged, instrumentalizes the new media to suppress music listeners. from the telephone to the radio. Liberally, the former still lets the participant play the role of the subject. Democratically, the latter equally makes all to listeners. Adorno goes into more detail about the functionality of a transmission by radio in which music is mixed with advertising. The following passage throws an interesting light on the quote from the Alpine Symphony by Richard Strauss in Romitelli's Dead City Radio. Adorno is speaking about a Toscanini broadcast. The Toscanini performance over the radio is, in a sense, unsellable. One hears it for free, and to every note of the symphony is added, as it were, the sublime advertising that the symphony is not interrupted by advertising. This concert is brought to you as a public service. The gigantic fact that a speech is heard everywhere replaces its content. Just as the convenience of that Toscanini transmission takes the place of its content, the symphony. The symphony becomes a premium for listening to the radio at all. Romitelli uses the quotation from Strauss' symphony and demonstrates its emptying of meaning. He tears the massive orchestral sound out of its context and exposes it to the decomposing filter mechanisms of today's media landscape, which has lost interest in specific content and instead advertises the free availability of any content. When I talk now about Dead City Radio, I first have to thank you, Mr. Abo, for saying that a few years ago, Romitelli wants to crystallize multiple meanings in one ambiguous title. The double title of Romitelli's piece, Dead City Radio /Audiodrome, is proof for the extreme intertextuality with which Romitelli consciously refers to various other sources of inspiration. At the beginning, I spoke about William Burroughs' novel, The Naked Lunch. In 1990, Burroughs released a musical album on which he recited excerpts from his works, especially from The Naked Lunch, accompanied by music by John Cale, Donald Fagen, and Sonic Youth, among others. This album was entitled Dead City Radio. A year later, The Naked Lunch was made into a film by director David Cronenberg, who 5 years later also made a film about James Graham Ballard's novel Crash, the novel that developed the idea of the erotic masochistic car crash from Atrocity Exhibition. Cronenberg had already made the film Videodrome in 1983, a science fiction horror film about a fictional television station called Videodrome, which broadcasts pornographic torture films that brainwash the consumer. Audiodrome is an adaptation of this title and is therefore to be understood accordingly as a radio station that manipulates listeners through the illusion of a stimulating program. The question is, and with this consideration I would like to conclude my lecture, is the listener manipulated, or does he voluntarily expose himself to the intoxication of violence? We should also ask ourselves why we are doing this to ourselves. Romitelli's music confronts us with drug abuse and excessive violence, and yet we feel a dark voyeuristic fascination. Huxley explained drug use as a chemical surrogate of religion. The ritual is torn from its religious context as a result of disappointed expectations of transcendence and is supposed to create a substitute in connection with drugs. Besides the longing for transcendence, today's society has an immense hedonistic urge, and the constant increase in sensual pleasure has already passed a pathological point. Visions induced by drugs can only partially satisfy the deep desire for sensation, and sexual desire has already turned to violence and destruction. Romitelli encountered dark truths in literature, and his music exposes us to these truths. That's why we can't turn away. That's why we feel this pleasure of intoxication. Thank you.
ist, deshalb muss die Diskussion jetzt ohne die Zoom-Konferenz stattfinden. Und im Anschluss an die Diskussion müssen wir eine kurze Pause von 5 Minuten machen, um den Stream neu zu starten.
Oh, okay, das ist ja blöd. Dumm gelaufen. Oh, there they are. Are you back?
Jetzt bewegen Sie sich aber.
All of you in the stream on Zoom, are you back? Do you hear me? Ah, perfectly.
Ist das Problem behoben?
Okay. Thank you very much, Jakob, for your very quite illuminating talk. Now for the questions, please.
To break the awkward silence. Thank you, Jakob. I was fascinated with what you mentioned, I think, from Barth about the significance of language. Maybe you can re-quote that one citation that I have it in my head again.
I have it here.
Yeah. With the one that Romitelli said regarding to Barth.
About language or about the type of perception and writing?
About the language, how the significance of it is for him, like how powerful the language is.
You mean Barth? The writer's language suspended between destroyed and still unknown forms is not so much a fundus?
Not this one, but but I don't think. I think maybe we all remember how Romitelli said how language is very powerful, or one of the most powerful outlets. Mr. Arbo is already nodding. I think maybe he knows which one I mean. So in your lecture, Mr. Arbo, you actually also mentioned that Romitelli was generally quite a humorous guy, but when it came to music, he became very personal, very sensitive, very serious. And actually, Jakob, I wanted to ask you: do you think, regarding this citation that you mentioned, that Romitelli is implying that the music is a very personal outlet for him, that very much represents his identity? Do you understand a little?
Yes, I think it's interesting that Barth decides these 3 points of style, language, and writing. So the language is the language which we speak, or the musical language which we compose and play. And of course today musical language is very pluralistic, but it is a sort of a social thing between society and me, between society and composer. The style is a subconscious thing which you can't influence. I think Barth means it so. And the writing is influenced by what you think, what you feel, what influences you from outside, especially from the media you are which you are explored.
Yeah.
And I think Romitelli is interested in the third point, in the writing, and also in the kind of writing which results when you are taking drugs. And I think he's more interested in this writing, but in the effects of drugs themselves, because he's interested in Rimbaud, Michaud, Huxley, who all writes under the influence or about the influence of drugs. He's interested in music by Jim Morrison and Pink Floyd, who are also associated with drug influence, and he's influenced by Gianluca Levici and Francis Bacon, who's also known for drinking hard in the evening and then getting up in the morning with a headache and painting. And I think that is what he's interested in, not in the drug or the intoxication as a thing, but in the writing which emerges from that.
Okay. Thank you.
I can add something. It maybe I think the question of language is properly the question of musical language, and the impossibility in a certain way to give up the question of renew the language. That was something very important for Romitelli, and this is something that is typical of a modernist way of thinking in music, and you cannot thing to a music that is not properly new. Donc, so personal is another question, but to renew the language, the musical language, was an important question for Romitelli all along his career, I think. I think donc, it's true, his first production is clearly marked by classical literary references. I think that is very clearly derived from the classical education, because Romitelli was in a high school that is a liceo classico, and this is typical. All these references, D'Annunzio, Marino, comes clearly from that. And you can think also at the beginning he was enrolled in the University of Trieste in literature. He wanted to continue the studies in literature. That was for 1 year, but is interesting for the first period of first production. Then I think clearly underground culture took over, and so all other references that you remember, recall, is very right. Your explanation. I remember very well his passion for Cioran. He used to quote his aphorism in the discourse, oral discourse. To me, they seemed relative too easy in a way sometimes, but he was really passionate by the aphorism by Cioran, and you have reason. His work is completely imbued with quotation. The title and his work are really a complex system of quotation, literary quotation, and in culture in general. The reference to Adorno, I think, is mediated by it may be to the culture industry is Pasolini. Pasolini was also a reference, a constant reference for him. I wanted to say also something about drugs. To my knowledge, Fausto did not use drugs. I think that it was a passion for this team already in literary roots. You can think, for example, starting from Baudelaire, Benjamin, all the discourse of this tradition on the opiate drugs, although he was actually interested in the effect of the mescaline and Henri Michaud, but the question was precisely the idea of the perception altered, taken to the limit, deformed. That was the center of his interest, absolutely. And so you can an hypothesis, at least some, it may be of this experience of altered perception were experienced effectively because of all the medication he was forced to take during his treatment. That's another question, but it was also a difficult experience in some way, and so, but other way, he had no direct experience with drugs, just to say that.
So you answered my question. I just want to tell you, did he use drugs? I was just invested in this because my thesis was also that he maybe, yes, it was my thesis that he never used drugs because he was interested in that what comes after drug use and not in the drug use and the intoxication as a thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
By the way, yeah, it's definitely right that his earlier literal influences were far more conventional than the later ones, that's right. But I think certain aspects are the same. For example, Jakob, you presented a real map, a network of interdependencies between the texts. And it seems to me that the early way of Romitelli to deal with texts is quite similar. And on the other hand, it seems to me that certain motives stay on. For example, this kind of love or obsession with the Mediterranean and with landscape that stays. And so in your next talk, you might present us the network or the map of his earlier literal influences, despite the fact that they might be a bit more conventional.
Yes, but I think the map of the early works would look a little other, because the early work is not so intertextual. They are in content. There are many references, but the authors didn't recite and quote each other. So in my map, I showed that they have all one string to Romitelli and nothing to each other. But in content, there are, yes, as you say, motives. Romitelli uses in early works leitmotifs, I think, leitmotifs of content. There are, for example, which Daniel also says, the light and the time, the sand and the time, which are two motifs which play an important role in the early work, in the text from which he took his titles for the pieces. And there are also 4 other motifs, I think 4 or 5, which equivalently appear always in the same context. There are the time and the sand, which are connected together. The sand as a medium which shows as sand of time, like in the sand clock, how the time is going, and also shows the footprints of life. There's this one piece, I think, Versilia, where it's described by Pablo Neruda or by D'Annunzio. I'm not sure. The sand on the beach, and there are waves on the sand like smilings, and these are the footprints of a nymph, which is going to the sand, and these are other motives. The nymph, which always stands in the context of desire or longing for transcendence and for peace and for immortality. There is the motive of the sea and a world beneath the sea as the empire of dead, like the Styx. There is often the motive of wind or of a storm, and this motive comes pretty later in Lost and in Poppy in the Cloud. In both we have a storm who is blowing over the world, and in Lost there sings in the last stanza, the woman sings, "I wish a storm would come and blow this shit away," and then the whole music breaks together. And this motive of storm he brings later also, but for example, this mythological nymph motive died about 1990 and didn't come later. Yes.
Now, I didn't think that I would ever be forced to try to pronounce this word publicly, but there's a question on the internet, and it's by tilting at Cthulhu. My question, do you think there's a correlation between Mescalin's ascribed effect of removing filters of perception and Romitelli's inclusion of non-canon pop authors later in his life?
Yes, in a way, I think. I don't think that Michaud made this connection, but Romitelli, also like this filter of culture industry, which I cited, thoughts of these mechanisms, which on which channels the media landscape and the culture industry is filtering different culture and transforming culture into products which are induced to us. And so you could say that pop culture maybe is filtered high culture. This is maybe cynical maybe, but I think Romitelli sees there a connection. Yes.
Thank you very much for this very, very nice talk. Thanks.
Thank you also.
I have the pleasure to introduce my fellow colleague Gaia Von Zichowski. She's a professor of education here at the Musikhochschule Lübeck, and prior to this she taught and researched at the University Duisburg-Essen, where she also submitted her habilitation or postdoctoral thesis. Her dissertation of 2005 deals with the interrelation of language and education. Her main fields of research are neo-Kantianism and post-structuralism. Her today's talk, Truth, a Horror Trip, promises new vistas on Romitelli's famous work cycle, Professor Bad Trip. And by that is a very good introduction to our evening concert today. Gaia.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me say that I'm very happy. My colleague Oliver Korte asked me to be part of this symposium because it may be astonishing for you to find a philosopher of education, what I am in first hand, in such a symposium. But now I heard the different lessons so far, and I think I'm not that isolated as I had feared before, because what Jakob Rieke did just before, you will find some of the authors he talked about again, but in a different perspective. And as Oliver said, my research is on deconstruction and post-structuralism, a kind of French way of thinking related to neo-Kantianism, which is as well a post-structuralistic thing to do. And I'm very curious about Mr. Abo's opinion, because he said this morning Romitelli himself didn't like the label postmodern. But what I'm going to do is I will try to contextualize Romitelli in a kind of post-structuralistic reading in a certain sense. And I wonder if you will accept or be convinced in the end. But now let me start.
A bad trip, horror trip or anxiety trip, is an acute intoxication by hallucinogenic substances, which is experienced as very negative and accompanied by severe anxiety. This acute intoxication can occur under the influence of various psychotropic substances, especially hallucinogens such as psychedelics, delirantia and dissociatives in high doses. People who experience a bad trip have panic attacks, the feeling of being alone, loss of self-perception, depersonalization, derealization, crying fits, paranoia or fear of death.
Did you hear the audio? Yes, okay, thank you for that. So, this lecture will include 3 prologues, 4 triptychs, and in between. It will be about drugs, deliria, megalomanias, and their deconstructions, philosophy of education, and finally, music. All the aspects mentioned are contradictory and correlative. The following is meant as a kind of performance itself. Jean-Paul Sartre experienced drugs as a student in 1929. He's reported that he injected himself with mescaline because he his writing, and he wanted to observe his own psychological processes. Because the dose was somewhat high, it had frightening consequences for Sartre. During the mescaline trip, he began to see various sea creatures, such as octopuses, jellyfish, lobsters, and crabs. Even after the actual intoxication ended, he continued to hallucinate and saw lobsters and crabs for several years. Had the mescaline changed his body permanently? The animals were almost always around him and followed him wherever he went. The cinematic means of the art production, The Lovers of Floor, make this vivid.
Dépêchez-vous, je vais être en retard. Qu'est-ce que vous regardez par terre? Les scarabées. Quel scarabée? La langouste! Attention, elle est énorme! Reprenez-vous.
Sartre eventually sought psychoanalytic help. By the way, Jacques Lacan was the analyst. And the analyst and his analyst jointly came to the conclusion that the lobsters were manifestations of Sartre's fear of loneliness and alienation from the people around him. With this interpretation and the accompanying overcoming of his fears, Sartre was able to separate himself from the hallucinations. Nevertheless, the drug experience flowed into his work. It became, as it were, the foil of his writing. In The Condemned of Altona, for example, one of the shut-ins hallucinates being observed by intelligent crabs and standing trial to the court of the crustaceans, which judges him. And even in Sartre's key work, Nausea, marine animals had already appeared several times. Figures has gruesome lobster-like thoughts, and the protagonist perceives his writing hand as a crab. I no longer saw my hand writing letters on the paper, nor even the sentence I had written, but beyond the paper, I see my hand spread out on the table. It's alive. It's me. It opens, the fingers unfold and point. It is lying on its back. It shows me its fat underbelly. It looks like an animal upside down. The fingers pause myself by making them move about very quickly, like the claws of a crab which has fallen on its back. The crab is dead. The author is dead, Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault will postulate as late as 1968-1969. Sartre has been the frightening writer since 1938, alienated from his work, which does not belong to him, but rather imposes itself on him to be written.
Mescaline, chalote, Lophophora williamsii, mescal button, peyote, peyote. Active substance of the peyote cactus can be extracted from cacti, but can also be produced synthetically. Effect: perceived sharpening of the senses, altered perception, more intensive color vision, loss of reality, feelings of happiness.
Henri Michaud, the surrealist poet-painter, or even the writer-draftsman, undertook 8 trials with mescaline in 1957, which he recorded in writing, among others, in Turbulent Infinity. Unlike Sartre, who was inspired by his intoxication after the fact, Michaud documented intoxication while intoxicated, which means immediately. This reads as a kind of stream of consciousness when it is not about get it done, which means letting oneself be honestly impressed. One has entered a shock zone, phenomenon of the great masses, but in tiny proportions, surging into infinity. With eyes closed, one has inner visions, thousands upon thousands of microscopic points of flame, dazzling diamonds, flashes for microbes. Palaces with innumerable turrets traveling under an unknown pressure in the air. Arabesques, garlands, fairground, an extremism in the light that drills into the nerves with bursting brilliance, extremism in the colors that bite you, jump at you, and brutal, hurtful their compositions. One has become sensitive to very, very subtle variations in the blood, in the cellular tissue, in the molecules, to tiny fluctuations of consciousness, of general sensation, which, by the way, in order to observe better, one is perhaps able to make visible at the same time. In the confused head, a surprising everything at once, noticeable. Ours is now that turbulence. What is described here as an experience of absolute ambivalence, disruption of experience, disruption of feelings and aspirations, absolute experience of the both and, in the neither nor, indeed in one. And that is the transcendence in immanence, total correlation experienced as infinitesimal and yet limited to the duration of masculine nation. Michaud also drew under masculine. The drawings are so fine, show vibrating lines and force fields, honeycomb and cell-like structures reminiscent of alien landscapes and zoomorphic forms. Although this description of the picture immediately brings to mind Michaud's cited literary account on the effects of the masculine, on the other hand, his painting is not a mere illustration of what is written. Rather, what is drawn goes beyond what is written. From a certain point on, language gives nothing, says Michaud. That is the point he decided in drawing. A certain separation of language and sign, he tears the signs loose from their languages in order to break their servitude. Speechless writing. So random art, a great expression of Max Bense, by the way, random, arbitrary, indiscriminate art, painting whose creation, whose surprise is based on a disturbance, not on an imitation, not on an illusion or an ideal. Interruptions, deformations, reversals, floods, panics, faults, mixtures, rises, falls, setbacks, and jolts. One cannot pursue enough the zigzag lines of Brownian molecular motion. The painter himself confessed in 1959, "I paint for the sake of surprise and at the same time for the joy of having recognized it. To hold it, the realization for a moment and for more than a moment. To hold on to some, fix the fleetingness of the intoxication, to bring out even the most vital rhythms and, if this is possible, and in masculine it is possible, the vibrations of the spirit itself." Here, painting refers to music. Images marked by streaming, sparkling, extreme seething, in which all remains ambitious and, although glaringly evident. One knows that one is under the sway of berserk trills, piercing whistles, grotesque cacophonies, and scales run amok as though berserk. Both painting and music are speechless universal languages, something that will occupy us later in relation to Romitelli. For the time being, as a final thought specifically on Michaud, his utopia remains. Oh, if only there were a universal language in which everyone could communicate, people, dogs, children, and not just a little, not just with reservations. The wish, the longing, and the vision of the real direct language have remained alive in me despite everything. This is the desire to be able to make understandable the transcendence in immanence, which is experienced as agonizing and not necessarily exalting. The linguistic, graphic, perhaps or not yet musical inability to do so can be read as a variant of the disempowered author who, under the impression of intoxication, experienced knowledge through the abyss, and only attempted to fix them in writing and drawing so that his reader-viewer might understand something in the intoxication of reception. For the writer-draftsman, Michaud does not have the truth, but his stupendous, astonishing, astounding power of expression is able to evoke infinite truths in the reader or viewer.
LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, acid, micros, sheets, trips, was first developed in 1938 as an ergot derivative, claviceps purpurea. It was used as a research substance in psychotherapy and psychiatry. Since the 1960s, LSD has been widely used as an intoxicating drug, a chemically produced hallucinogen with long-lasting effects, altered sense of time, alteration of optical, sensory and acoustic perception, reduced self-control, intensification of anxiety and depression, rarely drug-induced psychosis.
Michel Foucault consumed LSD in California in 1975 while professor at the University of California, Berkeley. What with the passion of Michel Foucault was not considered to be proven beyond doubt, the new release, Foucault in California, a true story wherein the great French philosopher drops acid in the valley of death, has revealed in the meantime. For the long hearsay manuscript that Simon Wade, at the time assistant professor of history at Claremont Graduate School and the arranger of this experience, wrote on the memories of the road trip and enriched with documents, has now been found, verified, and published posthumously by literary scholar and creative writer Heather Dundas. This is a first-hand account. During his stay in the USA, Foucault searched for diverse limit experiences, among others in the BDSM scene. His thought experiences became performance experiments with the guiding questions: what does it mean to play with domination and submission? Who is freer? Who more subjugated in sadomasochistic arrangements? Foucault drew from this experience for his theoretical conceptions of the subject, and he was open to this unforgettable evening in Death Valley. He was basically disponible, open to everything. Simon Wade, on the other hand, wanted to make it possible for him to expand consciousness because he considered Foucault to be a crisis. Wade and his life partner, the pianist and composer Michael Stoneman, have encouraged Foucault to experience altered states. He also willingly let himself go along with it because he was already convinced of it before the LSD trip. Our unconscious mind is shaped by and for others. It's a Foucault citation. Thus, he made one of the most important experiences of his life and emphasized until his death. Foucault followed the instructions of his two guides, and in the threes, Wade, Stoneman, and Foucault experienced Death Valley by especially the viewpoint Zabriskie Point and its surroundings under the influence of LSD. Wade described his perception thus: everything seemed artificial. I was experiencing the phenomena of many levels simultaneously, as if my mind were an 8-track tape, each sensation with multiple channels of its own. I could speak think, desire, hear, see, feel, imagine, remember on many discrete levels that connected to marvelous effect. Unimaginable synesthesia, immense worlds of delight, paradise found. In contrast, Foucault's statements about his experience are brief but fundamental. The sky has exploded and the stars are raining down upon me. I know this is not true, but it is the truth. He placed his truth in the context of sexuality, and his simple positing of an underlying correlation between sexuality and truth became the topic of his later work. The only thing I can compare this experience to in my life is sex with a stranger. Contact with a strange body affords an experience of the truth similar to what I am experiencing now. Thus, Foucault stated at the end of the Death Valley trip, I now understand my sexuality. On the other hand, the recipient is shown the ambivalence of this realization à la Michaud. There are no solutions, there are no answers. And yet Foucault confessed after this experience, I have since changed my outlook, I am more hopeful now. So he actually had for the duration of the moment a truth experience. Already long before, Michaud experienced not only with mescaline but also with LSD, described similar things in more detail. As if I could continue to think without a brain at the same time. How long could I? It occurs to me that existence has no form. One knew it, I feel it, this is grave. It is not reassuring. How can one ever hope to find tranquility if one has no inner form other than the metaphysical? Action freezes within me everything that in intelligence the will works on to disappear or has already disappeared. The supreme command of intelligence, your police. For both, truth experience seemed to me not that they really knew the truth, grasped it, or even held it, but rather that they sensed or felt it. Accordingly, Foucault declared that he had not been a scientific researcher under LSD, not really. I've not spent these hours reflecting on concepts. It has not been a philosophical experience for me, but something else entirely. What Foucault experienced in Death Valley 1975 can be summed up in the words of Michaud 1961 as knowledge through the abyss. Michaud might have warned Foucault of the ambivalence of such illusory knowledge. The feeling of total certainty. Because of this feeling, he gets further and further into his stories, which do not stand up to critical scrutiny, but they do stand up, and they stand up completely. He has received the blinding message of truth, this feeling of evidence which has nothing in common with the common feeling of evidence or insight, is something that one had to get know during the intoxication in its youthfulness, with this like a fist punch in its cartoonish mechanics, in order to understand that one cannot get in its way. The thought closes over you like a tightened suitcase lid, no way out. Sometimes it has happened to one who has experimented with substances that he has seen the thought, especially when it is foreign to him. Someone has just communicated it on the spot or on the telephone. Has happened to him in the last moment of freedom. 2 seconds are enough to see how it seizes him, how it snatches him. The mentally ill person does not feel appropriated. He is and remains in the abyss of evidence, an innocent slave who does not know that he is enslaved. This is how Michaud have enlightened Foucault. LSD uses delirium of sovereignty, delirium of maxima, megalomania, delusion of grandeur. Intoxicating knowledge is ambivalent, true and false at the same time. Whoever has it is as liberated, as enslaved, as self-determined, as externally determined, as insightful, as narrow-minded, as self-knowing, as a subject of foreign inspiration. On the other hand, this is precisely what leads to the center of Foucault's thinking. We are not masters of our own house, not sovereign subjects, not even persons. Rather, we are in the governmentality, in the system of power relations, victim as well as offender. As a result, Foucault regarded his thoughts and books as quasi-spotlights, at best as bumps, thrown into the respective contexts of infinitesimal discourses. When I say something, he said, with his steely eyes directed right at me, I'm speaking to the present. What I say is not intended to speak to the future, at last, in the sense that it will necessarily apply to the future, or that I can know it will be used in the future. This, the meaning of a sentence or work in relation to a person and or to a situation, speaking situationally to a person and writing in a particular discursive context, puts the speaker's or writer's tendency towards megalomania into perspective immensely. Gianluca Lerici, also known as Professor Bedrip, his pen name as a painter-drawer, is considered to be one of the most important underground visual artists of the Italian and European scene in recent decades. From 1980 to 1982, he was the singer of an Italian punk rock band and thus part of the first punk rock wave in Italy. He also drew record covers and fan articles for the punk scene under his pseudonym. He later graduated from the Academy of Fine Arts in Carrara and published his cyberpunk influence in the magazines Frigidaire and Decoder, but also internationally. His graphic style, described as unique, with thick black wavy lines inspired by underground but also mainstream comics, became increasingly significant. He developed a growingly ornate style of his own and created numerous cover colors, comic stories of punk obscurity and rock, as well as electronic sound experimental countercultures. Adjectives such as abnormal, delirious, dystopian, hallucinatory, psychedelic, spacey, and disturbing are attributed to his work and mark the Bedrip style. Lerici painted many of his paintings in vivid complementary colors and create lysergic effects and illusions of depth, especially when viewed through 3D glasses. Their motives actually seem to come from a horror trip. Symbols of the psychedelic tradition like eyes, skulls, hallucinogenic mushrooms, semi-human robots, or other technological nightmares, demons and disturbing rich capitalists and corrupt prelates, mutant freaks, gigantic anthropomorphic insects, alien creatures, etc. Lerici can be read as a quasi-Michaud with new means. No less surreal, combined music with visual art in forms of expression of subcultures, a musician painter or punk drawer. Professor Bedrip makes the present civilization perish, but at the same time evokes its uncertain rebirth in a new dystopian perspective. As Simon Waite eventually interpreted Foucault, so the Death Valley trip relegated to aesthetic designs. The Death Valley trip did not change the world, but transformed Michel Foucault. When he got back to Paris, he wrote that he had to begin anew. Foucault's final message to us is the supreme value of existence. He teaches us to elude the ruinous codes of the disciplined society and to make our lives into works of art. Professor Battrip can be understood as such an aesthetic design which was and opened up an aesthetic perspective which is deliriously disturbing, yet aesthetic. That artistic design once again is reminiscent of Michaud's longing for an immediate universal language. Romitelli already referred to the musician-painter and punk artist Lerici with the title Professor Battrip. Herewith, finally, or at last, the direct language of music moves into the center, but not before the intermediate consideration announced at the beginning. It's actually post-structuralist, less about Sartre, Michaud, Foucault, or Lerici. The authors, respectively the subjects, are post-structuralistically dead persons too, unfortunately. In this sense, neither Sartre nor Michaud, Foucault, or Lerici are trip tycoons. They are no magnates or grandmasters. The point here is not to stylize them as great lords. Rather, it is about their experience and their performances, writing, drawing, spraying, inspired by the experience of the substances mescaline and LSD, plus the representational world experienced more intensely under these substances, whose experiences, performances, however, have coagulated in their books, drawings, and comics into experienced and experienceable performatives. Foucault would have remarked critically, truth is an error that can no longer be rejected because it has been hardened by a long history. To pay homage to Sartre, Michaud, Foucault, or Lerici, or even Romitelli in the end, like idols at altars would take. It is not about the originators. The focus is on the statements. Man is in anguish, man is consequently abundant, mankind in despair, man is indeed a project that has a subjective existence, and man shall attain existence only when he is what he projects himself to be. There is no autonomous subject because it is subjected to a polymorphous bundle of power relations and surrounded by governmentalities. The claim of truth and suppression by truth is one of the tragedies of government. The subjugated subject has, nevertheless, post-enlightenment infinitesimally, ever and ever the will not to be governed, again and again in refusal of the reality of government. There is, however, no exit from it. There is no stop rule here. Whoever plays governing and being governed, however, becomes free in the game because the rules are self-made there, the duration of their validity is self-determined, the stop rule sets free and is obeyed, so Foucault about sadomasochism. The masochist is truly free because the masochist voluntarily submits and in a moment of freedom says, stop. These statements claim validity in performance alone because reality exists only in action. And also a truth is valid only for the duration of a performance because when I say something, I'm speaking to the present. This is probably as true for SM and a drug trip as it is for music. Composers determine entry and exit, lay down rules at the same time and give themselves laws. Musicians reactualize and interpret the composed settings. As listeners, we allow ourselves for a little while in self-chosen dependence or in self-chosen freedom, both as also and at the same time neither nor, to become involved in the music, to give ourselves into it. And in this way, we share in its truth. Fausto Romitelli is neither a trip tycoon nor is his work a triptych in the classical sense outlined above. It is not, in fact, an altar of the hard-boiled, This is my interpretation. Beyond the basic data, Romitelli's work has hardly been researched in the German-speaking world. Not at least for this reason, we meet here today and tomorrow for this symposium. My approach is to deconstruct Romitelli and in a narrower sense his, as Oliver Korte's announcement called it, famous triptych Professor Bedrip Lesson 1 to 3, with the help of the documents of experience presented so far. Afterwards, Romitelli can be read as the one who makes all the drug trips described above sound. In their shimmering ambivalences, that is, makes them performant when his Professor Bedrip sounds. We know that Romitelli read Michaud, that he knew Larichi's work is unmistakable from the title alone. Romitelli also pursued his personal research outside the cultured avant-garde, so his music also accommodates an expressive content of great eloquence and a violent sonic impact of considerable formal complexity. These qualities are featured in one of his most significant compositions, the trilogy Professor Bedrip, based on a reading of the works written by Henri Michaud under the influence of hallucinogenic drugs. In it, along with his taste for the deformed and the artificial, Romitelli added the sonic research of rock with an electroacoustic treatment of sound and instrumental gestures. Thus, he is also musically related to Larichi, who before, as we already know, played with the punkness and the countercultures of rock and of experimental with its electronic sounds. Depravity, German Verkommenheit, appears here as the guiding concept. Exuberant and instantly stagnant, the music was more and more on the way to deformity, because the negation of music of mysticism. I've never believed that music could become so dissolute, hand-packed, wild, mad, nefarious, disgraceful, subversive. For moments, there were also detours, loops, high-pitched notes, silly partnerships, never heard musical frictions, exaggerated contortions, a crazy dissection, voices strangely coupled with barking or jungle owls. The structures are not very inventive, but everything is suitable for parody. That's what it all boils down to. This music was played with badly perverted, ridiculed, and in a ridiculous way. It became anti-music, a mockery of all music, and its swing was not exactly highly lyrical. Through dismembered, denigrated, riddled with disruptions, it had nothing downbeat about it. A shameful comfort was her center, her nature, her secret, omnipresent, spasmodic, unbearable comfort. If one listened to her, if one followed her, one was subjected to a tugging, to aberrations, to disfigured expansions, to overturnings and tear-outs. While every shelter, every protection, every musical property was thrown off, one lay on a non-corporal bed and was attacked by discomfort. So much for a fitting passage by Michaud from Mescaline and Music, written in 1967, which is suitable as a description of what was composed afterwards, 1998-2000. Romitelli formulated in his language, the universal language of music, what Michaud's written language is only insufficiently able to convey. Depravity thus becomes tangible without the need to suggest a substance. Music becomes a drug, music as a drug. So far for the universal linguistic formal level. Let's have an insight in an audio video which makes it very vivid again. Just a short step in because reasons of time, but I found it here. maybe so far. We'll hear it later much better, I think. But I think you could have seen a kind of panta ray. Professor Batrip, it's no triptych of the hard-boiled in Foucault's sense, but something fluent to be experienced. In order to show further relationships, this time on a level of content, it should be pointed out also, Foucault had a deep appreciation of music. Music even played an important role for his Death Valley trip. Michael Stoneman, as the wizard of the trip, enriched the overall synesthetic experience by he switched on his portable tape recorder. The small tour group listened to the following playlist during the trip. Charles Ives, 3 Places in New England, Richard Strauss's 4 Last Songs, sung by Elisabeth Schwarzkopf, Stockhausen's Song of the Youths, Contacts followed, Michael Stoneman's interpretation of a preludium on a theme by Bach, and Boulet's Pli selon pli, fold on fold. Music is our theology, Foucault summed up, and accordingly the term triptych would be correct. Listening to the Death Valley playlist and to Professor Batrip is, of course, tantamount a religious experience. But the experience transcendence in immanence has nothing reassuring, but rather something deeply disturbing. Both listening experience to paradise, but to the hell of realization of our absolute contingency, singularity, possible and impossible at the same time, ambivalent, total randomness, and dependence on governmental circumstances, thrownness, being challenged to struggle for oneself and to struggle for selective realization, which only can fail. This is the Sisyphus task of our existence. This is what a horror trip and also Romitelli's bad trip show us. Finally, the imperative can be formulated following by extending Sant'Arcangelo, who said it in 2014, and naturally Romitelli himself, who composed it 1988, 1989, and said with it, have your own trip. Thank you.
Dear Gaia, this was a very, very impressive trip in itself. It's hard to decide whether it was scholarly or artistic, whether it was a performance or a scientific insight into something. Our problem is that it took exactly 45 minutes, and I think this wonderful talk doesn't deserve a very, very short question. So if you agree, we would postpone this to our last session and to our discussion, and there everything will come back on the table. I hope this is okay for you.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening too long.
Thank you very much. With this, I end the third session, and we'll all meet again in the evening at 7:30 for the performance of Professor Batrip, Lesson 1, 2, and 3. Thank you.